O vídeo a seguir não é indicado para quem é idiota e acredita na Terra plana.
Saudações siderais! Estamos começando uma edição muito especial do Conexão Sideral. 20 de julho de 1969. Exatos 48 anos atrás, o maior feito da história da exploração espacial se consumava: a chegada da primeira missão tripulada à superfície da Lua. A bordo da Apollo 11 tínhamos Neil Armstrong e Buzz Aldrin, o primeiro e o segundo homens a pousar no solo lunar e caminhar por sua superfície. Para comemorar esses 48 anos de uma grande realização, não só para o país de onde eles vieram, os Estados Unidos, mas para a humanidade, né? Pela primeira vez ficou constatado que seres humanos podiam visitar outros corpos celestes. Vamos ter aqui hoje uma entrevista especial com Buzz Aldrin. Ele que estava lá no centro da ação, o segundo homem a pisar na Lua, vai conversar com a gente hoje aqui no Conexão Sideral. Essa, na verdade, é uma entrevista que eu fiz mais ou menos um ano atrás. E eu gravei essa entrevista na época para usar depois o vídeo na íntegra, já pensando na ideia do Conexão Sideral. Então, de certa maneira, foi uma pré-produção aí para o Conexão Sideral. E agora, aproveitando o aniversário de 48 anos da missão Apollo 11, a gente vai conferir a entrevista do Aldrin. Ele fala de várias coisas interessantes, das lembranças que ele tem da infância, de como ele entrou no mundo da aviação e depois passou para a exploração espacial, do interesse dele por ficção científica. Vai comentar um pouco sobre vida extraterrestre, vai dizer se na Apollo 11 eles viram mesmo algum OVNI ou não viram, como é que foi essa história, além de abordar outras lembranças que ele teve da missão, o que os astronautas estavam discutindo no caminho, quais eram as ideias deles e como foi chegar à superfície lunar e enxergar o que ele chamou de uma magnífica desolação. Tudo isso e muito mais na entrevista que você vai ver a seguir. Confira aí. Hey, Dr. Aldrin, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for taking this interview. It's such an honor talking to you again. And I'd like to begin this interview going way back in time in a kind of personal way. I was wondering, what is your earliest childhood memory? Because, you know, I'm interested in the man. You're the legend, but I want to hear from the man. What's the first thing you remember from your childhood?
Well, I remember that I had a great admiration for American football, but I was not big enough. So I began to explore pole vaulting by getting higher from the earth than before, and this seemed like a very appropriate way. And I was with the swimming team for a while, but I didn't have enough endurance to go long distances, just short. But I wanted to go high.
See?
And since my father was a very early aviator and knew a lot of people, then flying airplanes was my objective. And as I grew up, older than you, why, I was a teenager, 11 years old, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and that was the beginning of the war for the U.S. So I followed very intently how we began to use aviation and airplanes to be a major determining factor in the outcome of the war. And I went to the military academy instead of the Naval Academy because when I was young I would get seasick, and many other things. I just decided a nice long runway to take off and land was probably preferable to try and land on a small aircraft carrier. So that led me to West Point, where I graduated just in time to go through flying school and to be involved in the Korean War. Now, all of that interrupted my pole vaulting because it was my major event at West Point. But that was the end of that. And just like airplanes began to be replaced by rockets, the bamboo pole for pole vaulting was replaced by one that would bend very much. So when new technology comes along, we humans have to adapt to that new technology. And when quartz crystals came along, I made a suggestion that the frequencies of quartz vibration were much higher and more stable than the tuning fork. So sonic vibrations were not that good. We needed quartz crystals and electricity to have very mobile accuracy. And then we needed better visuals for watches. And in many ways, I believe I became a self-appointed expert in what a watch should be and what it should look like for the user.
I see.
And I don't know exactly what year that was, but it's probably in the 70s or 80s.
I see.
After I left NASA.
So, you were telling me that you began by aviation, but I was wondering how space became your life, because you know, growing up in the 30s and the 40s, there was not much talk of space outside of science fiction. I was wondering what got you interested into space. Was it aviation? What made you tick?
It was science fiction. It was H.G. Wells and the War of the Worlds with creatures from Mars. I remember I was maybe 7, maybe 8 years old, and I went to school, and everybody was talking about the radio programs that had the invaders from Mars landing in New Jersey, and that's where I lived. You know? So I thought, wow, this is remarkable to write about the future. So I began to read more, and eventually it settled in on the great writer that I became very attached to, and that's Arthur C. Clarke, with his wonderful predictions for the future. So, distinctly, I am a future person, but I have to realize that we can only go so rapidly, but it's very easy to relax the support, because the support requires money and the people, the attractiveness, the popularity of people supporting.
And then, inspired by science fiction and working with aviation, you went to the space program. Everybody, I suppose, would like to talk to you about Apollo, but I'd like to come a little bit back first and talk about Gemini, because Gemini was so important for the developing of the technologies and techniques that were used in the moon landings that I was wondering if you wanted to comment about your role, your special role in developing spacewalking techniques with Gemini 12, and if that helped you to secure a place in the seats of Apollo 11.
Yes, that was certainly the case. My aviation experience in combat in Korea taught me how to attack another aircraft in the air and how to get onto a most correct, most optimum, ideal intercept. And that is what led me to each spacecraft, where we have a spacecraft and another one is approaching. How do we define the perfect approach? And that was the essence of my work at MIT, and I used, even back in 71 and 72, the Gemini spacecraft as sort of a model for what might be a first approach. So, since my model was that program, I began to talk to people in NASA who were beginning to think about not just Gemini, but for Apollo. And before I left MIT, the most important decision about how to get to the moon was made before I left MIT, and it was lunar orbit rendezvous, which meant instead of joining at the Earth, because we couldn't build a rocket big enough for Dr. von Braun, that we had to join things together before going to the moon, but it was much more efficient to go to the moon and join afterward to come back, or lunar orbit rendezvous. That decision by that creative engineer is the most important decision of implementing Apollo now. LOR. I believe the most important decision for the world and the U.S. to help go to the moon is refueling. And so I hope to spread the word that the most important is LRR, lunar reusable refueling, because the lander can be used again at the moon. And with there, you can just imagine how much easier. No big rockets, we just have to send the least expensive way, and we call it commercial crew. We're sending commercial crew to the space station. We need a new space station for commercial only at a more favorable inclination. The most favorable for the Gemini and Apollo was about 30 degrees and not 50 degrees. That was for the Russians. Mm-hmm. So if we do that to a new commercial station, that commercial station that I have in for design is the same design as the cycling spacecraft that will swing by the Earth and take people to Mars and then continue to be used. Now, we need 2 of these, but we're not ready to build those yet. We need to build the first generation of cycling spacecraft in low Earth orbit, where everyone can use it. Then it becomes very important to have the right orbit for this cycling spacecraft at the moon, so that it imitates the orbit of the moon of Mars, Phobos, the same distance. So we do at the moon, and we need 3. 1 occupied initially, and 2 more relay stations. Now, those relay stations can be future occupied stations in this same orbit, which allows the coalition of nations, Europe and Russia maybe, to occupy one, and Japan and China to occupy another. Then perhaps the U.S. can have a cycler between Earth and Mars and the Moon. That's where all of my thinking started, but it was changed to Earth to Mars in 1985. And that began my quest to get your ass to Mars.
Yeah, great. Well,
I won't be here to see that, but I have a son, Andrew, who is helping me with the Aldrin Space Institute here in Florida, with Florida Tech. And that will be using MIT and Purdue and Caltech to help plan the cycling pathway for exploration, so that the first spacecraft is a new spacecraft in Earth orbit. And everyone will know, the public will know, that that is the beginning of a cycling spacecraft for the Moon and for Mars. And so it gives an easy to understand pathway.
Well, let me ask you a bit about Apollo 11, because, you know, I heard you and Neil talking over the years that when you were on the moon, you were too busy to take a breath and think about the whole thing while you were at it. On the other hand, you had 3.5 days of space flight to go there and 3.5 days to go back. What did you think during those times? It's a lot of time to think about the subject. What went on during this trip?
We always look ahead all the way to the completion of the mission coming back to Earth. But there are many important things in our first attempt to make a landing. And we did not want distractions for the 3 days going to the moon. So we asked that they not have experiments that we would be engaged in going to the moon. 2 things were important once we left the Earth. On the end of a rocket, we had to separate, turn around, and then join the lander, so that the lander and the command module, and we called them Eagle and Columbia, but those weren't names until we were separated. We were always Apollo 11. When we separate, we become Eagle and Columbia. When Eagle lands, we become Tranquility Base. Now that was a secret. 4 people knew that. Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Charlie Duke, who was going to be in mission control talking to us when we landed. So he was the only other person that knew that we were not Apollo 11, we were not Eagle, we were tranquility base. All of us on the group for symbolism of the objective of our mission. And we thought carefully about the symbols that we should have representing our crew Apollo 11, the patch that we had. And there are interesting stories about that. Of course, the symbol of our country has been the eagle. And for me, I've got a little model airplane. Judy, could you go in there and see if you could get the small model that's painted red and white? That's the airplane I had my first flight in. So an eagle somehow going from Earth en route, getting ready to land, and we could show the moon as the eagle approached, and the Earth was in the background, and we thought that that was very good, and it so represented, and this was such a major achievement. And later we call it a small step for man, but a giant leap for man. And we knew that the achievement of having people on the moon would be very, very instrumental building block for the future.
Yeah.
We couldn't stay on the moon, and we hadn't designed to do that. But we asked other people to look at the design of the patch, and one person came up with a really good answer. Now, this is the airplane that I had my first flight in. And my father was working for an oil company, Standard Oil, and this was their airplane.
Cool.
And I was 2 years old when I had my first flight looking out that window. And so eagles have been very important, and I have tried to use the best name I can think of for a future spacecraft would be Star Eagle. Star Eagle.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool.
We've come close, but not there quite yet. But the person who looked at our patch said there's one thing missing. And he knew that there was a motto that would be displayed when we got to the moon that said, "We came in peace for all mankind." And I think the president approved that, and that so much symbolizes the way that the U.S. wanted to lead, but not with military people. They came from the military, but they were civilian, and it was an effort to lead other nations, not with a race. We were elevating in America, our technology to reach the Sputnik technology that the Russians, had displayed. Now, it ended up with a race, but there are good things about competition in the Olympics, but they're not so good things because, to use an example that I, for the rest of my life, have to use, in the Olympics, we have gold medals. for the person who comes in first. We have silver medals, and then bronze medals, and so forth. Forever and ever in history, I will be known. Not as first man, not as last man, but the second man. Now, I like silver, but it has gotten to be almost a joke, because when you know something and it is the way you know it and everybody else, a very intelligent relative of mine said, Buzz, you cannot change history. You are the second man to walk on the moon. Yes, we all know as a team we landed together and we did things in different ways to use the talents of the people in different ways. But we became so excited because of the newspapers and the television as to who goes down first that we lost track of, once you're on the surface, until you go back up again, what should the order, who is leading the activities? And clearly the reason why earlier flights, the commander stayed inside and the pilot or co-pilot did experiments, major experiments, and was the person who went outside. And clearly, in retrospect, in looking back, the commander, Neil, had such enormous responsibilities for launch, en route, separation, landing, launch, rendezvous. He was the person in charge, and we were helping him. So training for that, and of course Mike Collins had to be able to come back by himself. So he was more of the expert in the coming back and entry and landing. But the training that was responsible for the commander was very great and very tremendous. And we all helped him. But once on the surface, there could have been a more intense assignment of activities. It worked fine. It worked wonderful because I learned how to be an assistant, a follower, and Neil was a good leader. So mostly the on the surface activities were me following Neil. You can't describe it in really any other way. And it was that way because there was so much attention paid to who goes down the ladder first. And when I looked down from my window and saw Neil on the surface, there was, and thought about it afterwards, there was absolutely no way that mission would have been correct by Neil looking out the window and watching me go down the ladder and being the first one. That would not have made anybody happy, really, because there would always be the question, why didn't Neil go down first? And that was the right answer. So all of this was time-consuming discussions, just like when we separated and came back and joined up and then we separated from the rocket, and the rocket went toward the sun, and we saw it. But then we saw a light out in space that was going with us. I think we all three of us knew that it was one of the panels. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe one chance in a billion, it was an alien.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you, because, you've been misquoted a lot over the years about this very episode you're telling me, and I understand that. But I wanted to have your opinion on extraterrestrial life, because it's such a great universe. What do you think? Is there someone out there?
Now, Carl Sagan, the astronomer, probably very smart, has given more thought about humans, the practical, sending humans, and having maybe some life or something unusual. We didn't always agree with him, but he had the perspective of longer term and what's out there. And he made the very important statement that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And it's very easy to say, oh, there goes a UFO out the window. That's not extraordinary evidence. It's a very huge claim. And I think that humans will always have a struggle between what is practical and what we know and study and expect, and what is the unknowns that will always be alert. But then there are the unknowns too that cause something to go wrong in the spacecraft, and that affects the mission. And that's where our attention needs to be focused, not on thinking about way out there. One of the interesting things that I should have known is that for the landing sites, the crew always wanted the sun behind them. And this is where I can see the direction of travel coming around the moon, but you're not seeing it the same way. So to make it look, for you, it would be leaving the Earth and going around the moon this way. And that's clockwise. And that's what happens. But it's going from this direction. But most people think, okay, we got to the moon, and here's a map, and we went this way. So we have the sun behind us, but we have to approach the moon from the Earth and go around it. Now, if you think a little bit, as you go around the moon is going to be big, and it's going to cover up the sun. We didn't think about that.
And it was complete darkness, I imagine.
Surprise. When all of a sudden we looked out, and the sun wasn't there anymore. It was behind the moon, and the picture that we saw of the rays of the sun being blocked out, eclipsed by a very much larger circle than the sun was. We did not get a good picture of that.
You were talking about being the first or second on the moon, and I feel, and this I say very personally, I feel that you, Buzz, were representing all of us. Because, you know, Neil was very technical, very dry in his appearances. And you were the average person feeling all your descriptions of the moon and what you did. You were humankind over there. So I wouldn't feel bad or bothered by being the second, because you were us. And in that sense, I wanted you to comment on your description on the moon, which I felt it was very poignant. You said magnificent desolation. And I think this kind of redefines the feeling of human loneliness, because it sounds so lonely. I'd like to comment on that.
Well, I also think that it's natural in describing anything to look at the contrasts. It's not this and it's not that. It's somewhere in between. But sometimes you get very close to one, and then it's good description to point out what are the end points between seeing lots of things and seeing not very much. But that isn't what we were doing. If we went to the moon in sunlight and we landed and it was darkness, then that's a contrast. But the contrast was the expected dead moon. But we don't know what a dead Earth looks like. We trained in different places. And there was always, if we wanted to have some night with a searchlight, there was always a bug flying around in the beam or something growing here. And we knew that it wasn't a good simulation. But for us to move to such a bold step, to move toward going to that object, we can hit it. We can send something that hits it. We can send something that is around it. But now to be able to actually land and be on it, it doesn't have any air. So that makes it a big difference. Maybe helpful, but to have humans achieve something that is so much of a major step, it had to fit into the world of extraordinary, magnificence. Extraordinary can be very, very ugly, but magnificence is a very admirable, very major, significant discovery, achievement by humans from where we've been to where we now are looking. But if there's any description of where we are, what we're looking at, we knew that, and we didn't expect to see a green alien or bugs crawling over. It was something that I don't think there's any place on earth that you can recreate the total desolation. And that's sort of the best word. A lot of times I think if something just comes into my mind, and I realized that looking at extremes and describing extremes can sometimes be very very inspiring, but at the same time, it can be very humorous if it is not at all practical. It's just total absurd. And later, after coming back from the moon, I met with different people, with comedians, who told me the definition of comedy is to be talking about something, and then one of us says something like, I wonder if there's grass growing on Pluto. Well, that's absurd. And we'll smile about that, but if we don't smile, well, then the audience should be smiling. But just thinking about, we're talking about Pluto, and all of a sudden, and that becomes funny. It becomes notable. And I knew that there was going to be a very notable possibility for pilots, that we were all pilots. Now, when we landed, it's a good idea to tell somebody that we're still alive, we can talk, and we didn't crash. So it's a good thing to say, Houston, Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed. And we knew Neil was going to be the one to say that. But I knew that we were going to leave. And the person on the ground, after checking with everybody in mission control, the flight director receives a go from everybody. Then he says to the astronauts that's communicating, go Capcom, capsule communicate. He says, Capcom, we'll go for launch. Then he says, Tranquility Base, you're cleared for liftoff. I knew that was going to happen. Yeah. So I have to acknowledge that. So when it was conceived before, and I said, Roger, Houston, we're number one on the runway. And that is still a very good description. Everybody in the world knows that there isn't anybody else up there. And there isn't any runway.
Yeah, but it's fun. You know, but I wanted to know how much time we have.
Okay, just the punchline.
All right.
So I've been through that just to be funny.
Yeah, and it works.
We're talking about this, but I'm thinking about this, and I'm testing it quickly. Is it worth mentioning? Is it absurd? And a year ago, I started to think, why am I trying to be funny about this? This is thinking out of the box. Quickly. And then and that's innovation. That's changing things for the better. And it's in my book also. But that is the most valuable ingredient that Buzz Aldrin brings to space.
So, Buzz, my last question would be about your future plans. You're working on Mars, and NASA says it wants to go to Mars. I was wondering, what do you think of their efforts? Are they on the right track? And I'd like to comment on SpaceX. Do you think they have a sound plan for Mars?
I think he has something unusual, something, but he is not capable with the finances or the other friends to be able to do it by himself. It may sound very significant, very smart, but he is going to need. And they're expensive, wealthy people in the world, and I know some of them, and God, that if I were to go to 2 or 3 very wealthy people and say, could you put the money to make Elon Musk I thought maybe so. So I talked to Elon and I said, I know some wealthy people who might help you get the big rocket and other things. And he said, we don't need that. And he also said, we don't need to talk about how to get to Mars. Your cycling wave. No, we're going to build a very big rocket. And we're going to have a dragon and we're going to send it to Mars. It's still an open question, and I think the U.S. taxpayer, the U.S. government wants to be a major part. And if we have a very, very smart person here, it's not going to detract if we help him as part of the government, because it's not going to be just America, it's going to be all the global coalition that's going to go to Mars. So,
Thank you very much, Buzz. It was a pleasure as always. I thank you for your time.
are you from Brazil?
Yeah, Brazil.
Okay.
Bom, essa foi a entrevista com a lenda Buzz Aldrin. É a segunda vez que eu tive a chance de falar com ele, sempre é muito bacana, uma pessoa solícita que conversa, conversa às vezes até mais do que um jornalista gostaria, porque você faz uma pergunta e ele vai embora e fala 10 minutos seguidos, não necessariamente respondendo a sua pergunta, mas falando coisas que têm interesse para ele no momento. Então você viu aí os planos dele para Marte e o que ele acha que é a forma mais viável de fazer exploração lunar, o contexto das missões comerciais de exploração do espaço para esse futuro humano no espaço, dentre outras coisas, mas de toda forma sempre é muito legal, é emocionante poder conversar com o segundo homem a pisar na Lua, não é pouca coisa não, e afinal de contas só vai ter uma primeira missão tripulada à superfície da Lua, vai estar sempre marcada na história o pouso do Eagle na Apollo 11 em 20 de julho de 1969. Bom, esse foi o Conexão Sideral de hoje, mas, claro, semana que vem tem mais. Então fique ligado. Fui!